Now, if it was not for the internet, that kind of a possibility would just not have existed. So the ability to slice and dice and create communities over the internet is leading to the ability to reach out to smart people anywhere in the world. The earlier model used to say that to profit from R&D, you had to create it yourself and you have to ship it yourself, which is where you see a lot of the proprietary software companies having a very hard time adjusting to the open source model. But in the open source model community, we say that external R&D can create significant value. Innovation and the best ideas can come from anywhere. We need to be able to take those innovations, bring them into the products that we create, and then ship it out. Because at the end of the day, customers don't create where the innovation is created. What they care for is, does this technology work as it is supposed to work? There is also the model that it says that if we discover it ourselves, we can market it. But in the open source community, that really doesn't work. Now, if you look at the shift in the knowledge creation model, you look at the old notion of intellectual property and compare that with the model of knowledge commons. The IP model is basically control, restriction, the monopoly of an individual or a company. In the IP model, there is very little right to modify. Users have very little right to use also. And I'll show you some examples of that. And the typical model is the industrial age legacy, especially in the world of software, the per copy licensing model. In the knowledge commons model, it is share, collaborate. And what is interesting is that in the knowledge commons model, people are actually encouraged to take the software, modify it, and contribute it back to the community. So, question is, what are the forces that are driving this? The largest force is that the internet today is a platform which incorporates 1.4 billion people, and this is the largest collaborative platform in the history of mankind. And if you look at networks of the past, all the networks of the past were basically one-to-many or one-to-one. If you look at the telecom network or if you look at the broadcasting network, you never had this ability of having a massive peer-to-peer network where people could come together and create communities around very, very narrow slices of interest. The other is, apart from having that platform, the legal framework of open source. Without that, having that, the platform of the internet would not have made sense or would not have led to collaborative innovation. Professor Steven Weber, who wrote this book called The Success of Open Source, and if you look at the heart of the book, it's this one sentence where he says that the conventional notion of property is the right to exclude. But property in open source is configured around the right to distribute, not the right to exclude. The value of that model is that when we in India, 10 years ago, when we started to localize Linux to Indian languages, the reason we chose Linux, the general public license and open source software was because we could create the Indian language user interfaces on top of the Linux, the community-based software, and share it freely with others. So there is the fear that somebody would capture that, monopolize that, and make it into private property and not share it back with the community was not there. So if you look at the Linux and the general public license, the freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and adapt it to your needs, the freedom to redistribute copies so that you can help your neighbor. And this language is something, of course, obviously unusual for many licenses. We never, typically if you look at an end user license agreement, and I'll show you example of that, it is absolutely, it's completely around how to restrict your rights. But if you look at the general public license, it's about, which is the most popular open source license, it's about your rights as a user and how to share that, how to encourage more sharing with community. So here is proprietary software license, and I have deliberately changed the name of the company and called it ABC Corporation. And what it says is that you may not work around the limitations of the software. Even if the software has got technical limitations, you cannot do anything with it. So you may not even reverse engineer, decompile, or disassemble the software. So this is the extent to which the proprietary model goes to in terms of restricting your rights as a user. So the question is now, the collaborative innovation model, does it work? What are the proof points for that? So the theory is nice, but does it really work in practice? So Linux Store was put out some 10,000 lines of source code in September 1991. And in the early days of the internet and open source, nobody believed that a complex product like the operating system could actually be built by a community of volunteers scattered around the globe. People used to wonder, the compilers, the operating system, these are such complex products. How can a random group of volunteers scattered around the world create such a complex body of knowledge? But the fact is today Linux runs on, the fastest supercomputers in the world, the largest stock exchanges in the world like the New York Stock Exchange. These are all running on open source software. Take a look at things like Indian Idol, for example. When you're doing the SMS voting on Indian Idol, all that SMSs are actually going to an open source software, which is the server on the back end. When you're doing your ticket booking on, say, ClearTrip and those kind of travel websites, most of those transactions are also happening on open source software. So I think it's fairly obvious now that large complex bodies of knowledge can be created in a collaborative innovation model where nobody owns the software, but everybody in the community shares the knowledge that has been freely created. So there is this study which was done by the Linux Foundation, which said that if this 204 million lines of source code was created in a commercial manner, if it was contracted or outsourced to a company, it would cost something like $10.7 billion. I don't know what it would cost if it was outsourced to a TCS or a Wipro, so I don't know what the costing is based on. So, but $10.7 billion. So think about the fact that when you take Linux as a platform, and when you start localizing Linux to Indian languages, you're actually building on top of a platform which is worth $10.7 billion. And the value of that actually goes up when you create the Indian language user interfaces, because more and more people can actually use it. So the Tata Eka supercomputer, the one laptop per child, the Google Android, these are kind of technology innovations which would not have been possible without the ability to tinker with the source code. Another good example is Wikipedia, and every time I do this slide, the numbers keep going up. So every time I have to actually go back to Wikipedia and check the actual numbers. And it started in 2000. It's now one of the top 10 websites. There are 13 million entries, and I may be wrong actually, because I think it's now close to something like 16 million entries. 3.4 million articles in the English language. Some 270 languages around the world are active on that. 78 million visitors per month, 13 million registered users, 91,000 active contributors, and this is an encyclopedia that anybody can edit. So this becomes, from a public interest or a policy perspective, tools like Wikipedia could become, in terms of education in India, in terms of distributing knowledge to schools in India, these could be some of the most powerful tools that the Indian education system and Indian policymakers could make use of. The open source principles are basically collaboration, community, and the shared ownership of knowledge. And some of the gurus like Tim O'Reilly basically now say that sustained innovation is no longer going to be about who has the best scientists, etc., in their corporate premises, but it is about who has the most compelling architecture of participation, who has the ability to bring in the best ideas from anywhere in the world and incorporate it into whatever you create. So to kind of wrap up, why is collaborative innovation the model of the future, and why is it that policymakers should now start thinking about this new model of innovation? So with 1.4 billion people on the internet, and in the next few years you'll have another 600, in the next couple of years you'll have another 600 million people connected, which means that for the first time in humanity, you'll have almost 1/3 of humanity connected to each other, talking to each other, communicating with each other, sharing ideas with each other, and creating knowledge with each other. This is something that has never happened before in history. This kind of capability never existed with mankind. So now what you can do is you can create huge bodies of knowledge, you can create knowledge, for example, the open source drug discovery. So the software industry was the first industry to exploit the collaborative innovation model, because it was the software guys who created the internet. But the models of the principles of collaboration, community, the shared ownership of knowledge is not restricted to software. It can be applied to any field of human knowledge, which is why you see now that the open source drug discovery project is now, it has come up with some significant results in the last 1.5 years. And I was watching that very closely because there is always this curiosity, this model of innovation, does it work only for software, or can it also be extended to other fields? So we will have in the afternoon somebody from the open source drug discovery project also speaking. So I think there are a lot of questions that can come up there. And the architecture of participation creates a very highly leveraged model, which is a very, very efficient kind of a model. And the model of collaborative innovation, as I have explained with the example of localization of Linux to Indian languages, it's a model that creates a tremendous amount of value for society as a whole. And lastly, I can't resist kind of doing a comparison. This is something that I learned from my grandmother, that knowledge grows by sharing and it diminishes when we hoard it. And if you compare it with the GPL, the freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works, and if you look at the fact that over the last 18 to 19 years, from 10,000 lines of source code, Linux has grown to, average Linux distribution has grown to something like 204 million lines of source code. I think it is proof of what we have learned in India at the feet of our grandmother, that knowledge grows by sharing. I think the growth of the open source community, the growth of tools like Linux and Wikipedia are the finest proof that knowledge grows by sharing. And it's a model that we as Indians should particularly be more attuned to and encourage and grow. Thanks a lot.